Good morning, everyone, and those online as well. And thanks, Antanas, for the introduction. I'm sure you guys, as you've seen the media over the last few years, every time there's a fire, it's the worst, it's the earliest, it's the largest, it's unprecedented, it's unusual, something's gone wrong, it's all to do with climate change. And as I was digging around looking for things for the talk, I found this lovely quote from back in 1871 in the Pall Mall Gazette, not from Monopoly. But it's talking about weather, and this quote down the bottom, it says, every season appears to be extraordinary. Almost every month is one of the driest, wettest, windiest, coldest, hottest ever burned. So this idea of social commentary getting it wrong is not new, and there's ones earlier than this, but I thought it fitted in quite nicely with the fire story. Lots of people, scientists and the media and the general public all seem to think climate change is changing every single fire. Indeed, there's lots of work around, lots of things. We get the media throwing out about climate change raising fire risk. The Climate Council put together a fairly large and comprehensive report about fire threat. And if you jump on Google Scholar, if you've got a spare moment and type in climate change and fire, you come up with a cool 1.91 million results. And there's since the start of this year, there's 11,600 papers there. So it's a bit of a buzzword. I guess as scientists, we've been a bit guilty. We get more publications if we talk about climate change. But most of this work really has focused about the weather and fire interaction rather than understanding the process as a whole. And it's interesting, perhaps, if looking at these two headlines here, that they've now started to add in the word threat and risk. Up until a couple of years ago, it was assumed that if the weather changes, the fire changes in the way that we expect. Those of you who did bushfire and climate have seen this and probably bored of this by now, but that's bad luck. Vegetation fires are not just driven by weather, they're driven by four processes, and there's a four-switch model that's been around now for about 7 years, and it was first proposed by Sally Archbold, looking at South African studies, or Southern African studies, I should say. Ross Bradstock published something at about the same time, and Max Moritz then expanded on this work. And their argument is that we have four switches: fire weather, fuel biomass or fuel load, a fuel moisture, which reflects the availability of fuels to burn, and ignitions. And it's not until each one of these four switches are actually switched on that we can actually have fire. So in their argument, if climate is going up all the time, that's this just one switch, but unless these other three switches stay on, we're not going to get fires, or we're not going to get worse fires. There is a little bit of argument about whether they're switches or dials, and we'll come into that a little bit later. But we really need to understand what these four switches are and how each of these four switches work by themselves, but also how they interact under current and future climates. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is I'm firstly going to go through the evidence about future changes in each of those four switches as a function of global climate changes and population changes. And then I'll present some work that is fairly new, that we're looking at how you can actually model these expected changes by setting up a system which considers the interdependencies between these switches under current and future climates. So if we do start with fire weather, where everyone else has started, there's a number of fire danger indices around the world. Australia use MacArthur-based systems, and they feed into what you guys would see on the side of the road, this fire danger rating, or loosely termed the watermelon by a lot of fire management staff. And this tells you how bad the fire weather is, and it's originally was set up as a measure of suppression difficulty. And that's when we stopped up here as extreme, and Code Red came post Black Saturday. And without diverting down that path, basically there's a number of inputs into these fire danger ratings, and they vary slightly, but I've loosely put them as temperature, fuel dryness or fuel moisture, relative humidity and wind speed, and each of them vary a little bit in some of the other inputs. But they're very much a weather-driven system. So people have used this fire weather or this fire danger index to actually predict how things might change, have changed or change in the future. So the first bit of work I wanted to present is some work done by Hamish Clark when he was a PhD student at New South Wales Uni, and he worked with Chris Lucas from the Bureau of Meteorology and Pete Smith, who was at Office of Environment and Heritage. And what these guys did is they went painstakingly through the Bureau of Meteorology observations, and they went to a number of reliable stations, and they worked through a whole stack of details having to deal with when stations moved, some of the measurement error, etc. And they've actually plotted out FDI and the changes over decades, actually starting in 73, not 1970 there. And what the map represents here is the average decadal change in FDI points. And so basically, the bigger the points are there, the bigger the change that you actually have been recorded over the last 40 years. And the open circles represent ones which aren't significantly different, but are showing a trend. So we can see that through the centre of Australia, there's been the largest changes. So over the last 40 years, there's been an average increase of about 10 FDI points. On the coast, it's a bit more moderate. It's about 4 or 5 points. The east coast here, Melbourne's a little bit higher. And interestingly, up in the north, there's a few changes as well. And when you plot it out, you can see there's a nice trend going up, but there's also a lot of noise. It's a lot of bouncing around that line. So we still have good years, we have bad years in there. It's just the average is moving up. So this was some fairly major work, and it took a lot of time, and Hamish lost a fair bit of hair over this, but it's been a nice part of the story, and this actually did trigger a lot of the reports about fed into the climate change report that the Climate Council did. So what we thought we'd do is we looked at the same period, and we actually wanted to decompose the fire danger indice. We wanted to look at the various components and see which of those components are actually changing over time, and can we actually relate this to fire. So we're still dealing in the past 40 years where we have been recording climate change, and we took a gridded weather product that came out of the Bureau of Meteorology, and we looked at the bioregions or the subregions around southeast Australia. And we had South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria, because we were able to match the fire data and the weather data as well. And I'll come to the fire data shortly. So we broke it down. We have 2 temperature measures up the top here. We've used SPI, which is a standardised precipitation index. So that tells us how far from the rainfall anomaly we are. So it looks at average annual rainfall, and if it's below that, you get a low value, and if it's above that, you get a high value. We've got humidity here and also mean daily wind speed. I will point out this is a little bit of a flaw, that we're going on mean speeds rather than extreme speeds, which are more important for fires. When we looked at the components, red means it's getting hotter, green means it's getting colder for temperature. We can see that most of the area is actually getting warmer in our 2 measures, average maximum temperature and number of days above 35 degrees. Although interestingly, some of these western areas have showed a cooling trend over the last 40 years. In terms of soil dryness, we looked at 2 periods from July to December, so leading into the fire season for most of these areas. And we got a drying trend for some of these central areas, but actually a wetting trend up here in the north, the northeast. And then when we looked at the start of the fire season into the winter, or usually the wetter area for much of this time, we actually saw there's been a bit of a drying period here, but again with a bit of anomaly there. Looking at humidity, so days less than 15%, we can see that interior area where Hamish was having the large change in FDI has shown a fairly strong trend towards drying out, so more days less than 15%, but really no trend on the coastal areas whatsoever. And the daily wind speed, we actually are getting a bit of a stilling across the continent, particularly in the southeast, but that trend does apply elsewhere. So with the exception of southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales, most of the country has actually experienced a stilling in wind speed. And wind speed is extremely important for fire behaviour, fire spread and fire control. So it's interesting that this is going on. But again, it's not picking up those peaks on those odd days, which may still cause problems. So we thought this was quite interesting, but we wanted to go a little bit further. We know that weather influences fire, and so we've got fire history for these periods as well. So we wanted to look at how weather influences fire and how times influence fire to see if we can actually detect some of these changes in fires we might expect due to climatic change that we've been able to record over the last 40 years. I'll just step you through the different types of responses that we thought we could actually get. So we could have the very basic situation here where weather, represented by the cloud, probably not the best for fire weather, but weather influences fire extent, and that's it. So we just have a weather-driven system. The weather's not the critical factors for that area aren't changing over time, so weather's just related to fire, no change. We have the next situation where we've seen from time is influencing weather, so our fire weather's getting worse over time. And a relationship between fire and weather suggests that because those weather events are changing, fires are getting more because the weather's getting worse. We then have fire increases that are independent of the weather. And this is where we got relationships between fire weather and fire extent, but those fire weather components were not influenced by time. However, the extent of fire was influenced independently of weather, and it was increasing over time. Then we got this fun one where we have time is influencing the weather, which is influencing the fire. So we're getting a partial increase in fire extent due to changes in weather. But then we also have an additional effect of time. So there's something more going on that we're seeing a greater increase in fire extent than we'd expect purely by weather alone. And then we can have all of the above, but with blue arrows indicating that fire is actually going down because those weather components are actually changing as well. So we put it all together and came up with this map. And I'll walk you through it slowly. So we can immediately dismiss these white areas here because there was just not enough fire data over the study period to make any meaningful assessment of whether things are going up or down. The green areas here, we had fire related to weather components, but we're actually seeing no change over time. So weather still influences fire in these areas, but those weather components aren't changing. So the yellow, orange and reds are all different ones which are resulting in increased fire activity. So pretty much down the Great Divide and into South Australia here, we're seeing increase in fire activity. The red is where we're getting increases that are not influenced by weather. The orange is areas where we're getting increases that are partially due to weather and partially separate or independent effects. And then the yellows where fully dependent on weather, but we're seeing weather increase in these areas over time. And then the blues are actually decreases. So we had two regions here, southeast New South Wales and the southwest of Victoria there, where we actually recorded decreases in fire activity over the last 40 years. And these were also partially influenced by weather. So they had components of weather driving it down, but additional decreases as well. So when we compare that to Hamish's original map of fire weather and fire weather increases over time and where we're actually seeing changes, there's not really a good correlation there. We can see these internal areas where we're seeing massive increases in FDI. We're seeing no change, perhaps even a decrease down here as well. The coastal areas here, where we're seeing moderate increases in FDI, are the areas where we're seeing the biggest changes, but we're seeing both positive changes up here, and that dot falls nicely on the border of those two there, but we're also seeing some negative changes as well. So the relationship's not perfect, and using it here to say really fire weather isn't the only thing driving it, and the evidence really strongly supports that. So if we move on and start to think how maybe some of these other switches, if you like, might start to influence things and might feed into these changes that we're seeing. So we look next at ignitions, very simply the process of setting the fuel on fire. In Australia, we've got a variety of sources, but some of the most common there are lightning, arson, accidental, so things like machines, roadsides, campfires, etc. In the area we're dealing with, lightning accounts for about 10% of the ignitions and human sources account for about 90% of the ignitions. And we know we've got a lot of spatial and temporal variation in these, and so we've done a number of studies starting to look at the patterns and the drivers of these and trying to understand how future climates and future population changes might affect these. This is some work I did up in the Sydney Basin. We went through and we looked at about 1,000 ignitions over the last 15 years, and we plotted them out and compared them to random points. And we looked at a whole range of factors: distance from road, distance from houses, age of the fuel, and the FDI on the day the ignition actually occurred. So we had a reduced data set because sometimes they didn't actually know when the fire started. There were a range of other factors driving it. Generally, human factors drive human ignitions and landscape factors drive lightning. But this graph here shows that with increasing time since fire, we're getting on the y-axis of the probability of ignition. So for arson ignitions on the left here, the probability of fire goes down with time since fire, which is probably a factor that arsonists tend to go where they've seen fires before. But in lightning, we're more likely to get fires in older fuels. But the more important or more significant results are the differences between these lines here, and they represent increasing fire weather. So these are the different FDIs we were talking about before. These are low down the bottom up to extreme. We haven't included catastrophic because they so rarely occur in the study region. For the case of lightning around here, at about 15 years since fire, we can see nearly a fourfold increase in the probability of a lightning ignition resulting in a fire. When we go from a low FDI, so somewhere around 12, up until the 75 to 100 range. And we're seeing similar patterns over here for arson as well. So fire weather gets worse, ignitions are more likely to occur or result in fires. But that's probably not all the story. A PhD student of mine, Katie Collins, has gone through and looked at these a bit differently. She used the data set that we used in the paper I was talking about before, where we decomposed FDI into a range of different values. And so Katie was looking at these values on an annual basis to look at annual rates of ignition in New South Wales and Victoria. And she found that different components affected different ignition types. So the different bars here represent accidental, deliberate ignitions, which is arson, lightning, undetermined, and then total values there. So climate has a very strong role on ignitions, but we know it's not all that's there. So native vegetation cover, which isn't surprising, you're more likely to get ignitions in native vegetation because they tend to be more continuous fuels. But then some patterns, so elevation drives a whole range of other things, their influence. Lightning influences lightning, which shouldn't surprise anyone. And population density influences all the ignitions except for lightning. And we know populations are changing over time too, so we think that spreads of populations may actually, even though we break up the fuels, may actually increase the number of ignitions that we have as more people have more access to vegetated areas. So Katie then plotted out where different ignitions occur around the state using those patterns that were going on there, and she's broken it down here into accidental ignitions, deliberate, lightning, and undetermined. And you can see there's a much stronger or larger ignitions in these coastal and range areas where the forests are, and these tend to line up pretty well with most of the increases with our little odd areas down in the southeast and the southwest there. But if climate change is resulting in increased ignitions, we'd actually expect to see the number of ignitions in all these areas coming up, and we're not really seeing those trends at the moment. So there might be some changes in ignitions, but we may actually be reaching the point where our systems are saturated with ignition. So that ignition switch is more or less switched on the whole time, and we don't have much control in how we change that. And I think there's a whole another lecture in the social aspects of managing those 90% of ignitions and how you deal with people. And I won't pretend to be an expert in that at all. So then the last switch that we really want to start to think about is fuel and fuel availability. So this is the fuel biomass and the fuel moisture. So I'm sure you're all aware you can't really have fuel without a fire. Can't have fuel without a fire. Can't have fire without dry fuel. You can't have a fire with wet fuel. So we need to know how these things are going to change. And we're looking at the combustible material. So it's leaves and twigs and bark on the ground, but also in the trees, the shrubs, and at times the canopies as well. And people have thrown out a whole range of ideas about how climate change may result in these things. So it may result in lower fuel moistures. It's hotter, it's drier, fuel moistures are going down, they're more likely to be available. But there's also a lot of uncertainty about how fuel loads may change, so the amount of fuel available to burn, the continuity of that fuel, but then also the structure of the fuel. If all our fuel's on the ground, we get a very different fire than if we have a highly structured fuel that allows us to get into the big canopy fires that we see. And so I'll go through some of the evidence for each of these. Fuel moisture is something there's not a huge amount of work on. There's probably only a few people around the world that have actually got the skills in fire to actually work with this, and I'm not one of them, but I'll present a couple of the key studies. So Stuart Matthews, who was at CSIRO at the time, now with New South Wales Rural Fire Service, brought together a whole lot of information from fuel moisture models, and he has a very complex fuel moisture model that has about 12 inputs and several different strata that moves through. And he used that model in combination with some of the global climate change models to look at how fuel moisture content might change under future scenarios. And he looked at a range of different global climate change models, and he looked at he categorised the different years that we might have, and so he's called them warm and dry. He declined to name the intermediate year, and then cool and wet, because these were the range of years that came out. And so they just represent the different colour lines here. So we have the moisture content here and the month of the year across the bottom. Not surprising, this was done for Sydney, and he has expanded it elsewhere, and the patterns are more or less the same, but you see the fuels are wet in winter when we don't really tend to have the fire area. And then in Sydney, the fire season kicks off around September, October, and then runs through to around January, sometimes into February. So we see that pattern going on. We can also see that fuel moistures obviously increase as you go from a cool to wet through to a warm to dry period. So hotter, drier gets drier fuel. So it's all fairly straightforward. But he was then able to look at how this plays out into the number of fire days, the number of days where fires had actually spread to a size which could start to be of a concern. So under these scenarios, it gets the reverse pattern. And I think the key thing here is under the warm, dry years that are coming up in the future, we're actually starting to see that around 28 to 30 days of the month, so pretty much every day, is starting to get into the point where we have fire danger days or days where we can have fires. And under the cool wet years, we're somewhere in the order of 20 to 25, depending on which month we're looking at throughout the fire season. Mike Flanagan's probably the other key player in this game, and he's just actually published this, and he was presenting this week at the Fire and Fuels Conference. And Mike's undertaken a fairly major change looking at the boreal forest up in Alberta in Canada, and tried to model what was likely to happen under changing climates and looking at different temperature changes, which are the different colours here, from no change down the bottom up to 5 degrees changes. For this area, they're predicting that by 2100, they may actually have a 6-degree change in temperature. They've already tracked at about 2 degrees change already. And they were actually looking at what happens to fuel moisture, which is on a slightly odd axis here, going from dry at the top to wet at the bottom, with different rainfall changes under these different models. And probably the key result that came out of this work here is, this is our line now. And if we want to maintain current fuel moisture levels, and we have experience a 1 degree temperature increase, rainfall actually has to increase by 15% to compensate for that and maintain the fuel moisture values at the same point. That's a fairly major shift in rainfall required to compensate a 1 degree temperature change. So as I said, they've actually gone up 2 degrees already. So it's about a 30% increase in rainfall that they're going to need now, not in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, but now, to compensate for that, to stop changes in fuel moisture. That's fairly frightening, and it's probably one of the areas where we're going to see a lot more fire very soon. So that's the fuel moisture and the availability. Fuel loads are probably something that are easier to play around with in some senses and work with. And this is some work Alan York and myself did, how many years ago? 8 years ago. Where we looked at a study site up on the New South Wales North Coast, the Bulls Ground study site, where they'd done 22 years of data collection. And it's very nice to be handed such a data set where they went out and every quarter they measured surface fuel loads, they measured litter fall, and they're looking at things such as leaf litter, twigs, bark, etc. And we were able to take this data and match it with a nearby weather station, and we could look at the rate at which litter was coming in and the rate at which litter was decomposing as a function of a whole range of things. There was fires in these sites, but we looked at quarterly temperature and rainfall and able to come up with some sort of a model for what was going on now, and then look at how that climate might change in the period of 2070 to 2090 and see how climate change might affect these surface loads. So the first thing we did was take out a subset of the data, and I'll just run you through this graph. We've got the fuel loads here, or the fine fuel loads in tonnes per hectare on the y-axis, and we have the period from 1970 to 1992 when the study was run. The study site had frequent burning, so every 3 years they're running a low intensity burn through here. So these black dots here represent the fuel loads on the frequently burnt sites, and the white or the open cell dots on the top were the unburnt sites. The dots and the error bars around them, they represent the actual measured data that are out on site, and the grey area in the background represents our modelled data. So we think we did a pretty reasonable job of taking a subset and predicting onto the rest of it and coming up with a model. There's a few little anomalies, but here probably didn't get a very good fire, and we had a slight under prediction here, but broadly speaking, our model was working pretty well. So we felt comfortable then shifting it into a different time to see how the fuel loads might change. So I've taken out the points there, and so we still have the grey areas in the background. And then we have this hash, or the lined area up the top for the predicted unburnt sites, and then the predicted burnt sites down the bottom. You can see there's an average decline in surface fuel loads here. They do bounce around a bit with the climate there, but there are periods where it overlaps as well. So despite changes, we can end up more or less the same. So there is a small drop, but it's probably not a drop that from a management perspective, you'd be saying we're going to get a change in fire. The fuel loads are still there at a level that are going to sustain fire at a reasonable sort of rate. But surface fuels are only really one part of the story, and we really want to consider what happens in the other strata as well. So we have things that we'll look at, so near surface fuels, grasses, so things that are pointing straight up and continuous enough can result in much faster rates of spreads. shrubs, which may result in bigger flame heights, but may also carry your fuel up into the canopy. And then, of course, once you get there, you've got bark and canopy in the trees that can contribute as well. So we were quite interested in looking at this, and so there was a study that Kate Hamill led in the Blue Mountains that I was involved in, where a natural experiment was set up. The area is really good for this. We're able to look at gradients of rainfall going from south to north, and then temperature going from east to west. And within that area, 9 sites were put up. So we had 3 rainfall, basically a 3x3 grid, which was the rainfall and temperature. And within each of those 9 areas, we grabbed out 3 replicates of 3 levels of fire frequency. So it's 2 fires in the last 30 years, 3 fires, and then 4 fires. And they were all standardised and nicely burnt in 2001, so it was a very nice experiment there. We wanted to look here at what the diversity changes we're likely to see were going to be, but also what was the functional response. So we're looking at whether or not resprouters or non-resprouters were likely to come back, and those that had a persistent seed bank versus those that didn't. And if there was any biases or changes here that we could perhaps infer what might happen under future climate and what changes in fire might actually do to that and where the important drivers are. I don't have time to go into all the results, but I'll just summarise some of the key ones here. When we looked at total species richness, we could see species richness increased with rainfall, but also increased with temperature, and fire frequency had a very minor effect on it. Probably something that in a, statistically, yes, it was there, but in a management or in a reality sense, it has such a small effect, you may not really worry about it. So as temperatures go up and rainfall goes down, we'll probably see a balancing or a maintenance of species richness. But it's once we start to get into which sorts of species are changing, it gets a bit more interesting. So the resprouting species actually decline as rainfall goes up, but also decline as temperature goes up, but it's a shallower relationship. So a drop in rainfall will probably, despite the increases in temperature we see, we'll probably see more resprouting species. The non-resprouting species respond to rainfall in a positive way, so a drop in rainfall, I'd like to see a drop in those, and don't seem to be influenced by temperature or fire frequency at all. And then the seeding species are similar, responding most strongly to rainfall, so we might see a drop in those, but only a small response to fire frequency. And the non-seeding species had fairly weak relationships. We wanted to look then at functional groups, so whether the shrubs and the herbs are showing these same patterns or whether they were different. Without putting you through the pain of going through 1,000 graphs, the summaries are pretty much here. That resprouting species that have that also seed, they're likely to go up in herbs. So the grasses that we're seeing there, we're going to see more of those. And we're also going to see more of the resprouting species that don't have a strong seed bank. The non-resprouting species in the herbs, we didn't see much of a response. Perhaps the most interesting part of the story is when we got into the shrubs. The resprouters, despite predictions, were actually going to decline, but so were the seeders as well. And there wasn't the fourth combination there. So we're seeing an increase in herbs, but a decrease in shrubs. So I think we'll talk in classes after this about what that means for biodiversity. But in terms of fire behaviour, that's quite significant. You're shifting from a litter-dominated system with highly structured forest to something that's more akin to a grassy woodland, which is quite a shift from the photo that you can see there. So what this probably means is these areas will be able to sustain more frequent fires, but they're going to be of a lower intensity. And that might change quite a bit of stuff for biodiversity as well. There's a grumpy old man that occasionally comes to speak to me, and they said, well, that's all well and good, but all these studies, all they focus on is what happens at one point in space, in time, and assume that's still going to be there in the future. And we know that climate change is going to result in shift in vegetation communities and move them around. So unless we start to account for those, we really actually don't know what's going on, because if a system changes in one spot, it might be replaced elsewhere, and the overall balance of fire will be the same. So a couple of years ago, I was involved in a large project which was managed out of CSIRO, and Stuart Matthews was running that. And there was a whole bunch of projects in there that were looking about how trajectories of climate change, ecosystems and fire regimes might actually look. It was a fascinating project, and we all surprisingly converged on very similar answers, but I'll just present the work that we did. And what we were doing is trying to answer that question. If you model vegetation communities now under the present extent, and considering whether climate might actually be a driver as well as a range of other things, we can then move forward and model those under 2030, 50 and 2100 climate predictions. And we looked at 4 climate models, and we also looked at 2 emission scenarios. And And so these climate models were chosen to because they're tracking pretty well for now for our region. And the two scenarios was a high emission scenario, which we seem to be tracking pretty well on, but a low emission scenario just in case we got it wrong. We used some other work that we've done before about estimating fuel loads as a function of temperature and rainfall. And we're able to then combine the predicted vegetation community with the predicted fuel loads for that community to come up with some sort of probabilistic estimate of fuel loads across the state of New South Wales. So first off, we have our predictions on the current distribution of the different vegetation types. So we have dry sclerophyll forest here, which tend to have a shrubby understory, the wetter forests, grassy woodland and rainforest as well. And this is one prediction here for the future under a particular, one of the worst climate change predictions, but you can see a drop in most of these forest types and a shift a little bit in the grassy woodlands. And rainforest came out as doing particularly well, but that ignores the feedbacks that fire might actually play with them. Once we modelled these, we put together the fuel loads and everything. These were the different outputs that we got. And what we have is the percent change in fuel loads on the y-axis. And we have the A1, F1 emission scenario here, or the A2 emissions. So this is the high emissions and this is the low emissions here. And then we're moving forward. And the lines here just represent the different climate change models. What we can see is there's something happening by 2030. It might be a slight increase or it might be a slight decrease depending on which model you use. But under all models, by the time we get to 2100, we're somewhere between a 5 to 10 or even up to a 25% reduction in fuel loads across the state. So that's a fairly significant shift if our models are actually correct. So far, then we can say that surface fuel loads are probably going to decrease, fuel structure or complexity will probably decrease, fire weather is probably going to increase, so fuel dryness will probably increase, and ignition probabilities are likely to increase. So we should be seeing the world turning into an inferno, really. So what we thought we'd better do is actually look at this, and if that was the case, go to Mars. But try and fit all these things together and look and see if there's feedbacks here, if there's controls and how they might actually change. So a couple of years ago, we got together at Creswick in the middle of the winter, which is a good time to think about fire, and put together a conceptual model of how we thought these things should work based on all these studies and see if we can predict changes in area burn down the bottom here. So just to run you through this quickly, we have topography, which influences climate, and climate pretty much is fire weather. But climate also influences productivity, which affects the fuel biomass and the fuel moisture. But topography, productivity also affect lightning. So in highly productive sites on hills, you tend to get more lightning than those where you don't. But productivity has actually influenced our built environment as well. We've built our cities in areas where there's been close to agriculture. And so we're actually unable to disentangle where people live from where the fuel is. So there's been lots of studies that say people are responsible for ignitions, but these models are starting to suggest that, well, maybe it's just the fact that we're in productive sites that can sustain ignitions. But these links are quite interesting, but these all come down to the ignitions that we have, and these are our 4 switches here affecting the area burnt. But we also know from the work we've been doing, there's interactions between all these. So I won't bore you with details of Bayesian networks, but we actually put this into a statistical model for southeastern Australia. And it broadly looks like this, which is more or less our conceptual model. So we have our weather, our topography, our productivity, human environment, 4 switches and the fire. And what we did is populate this with data from southeastern Australia as well as southwest Western Australia. So we picked New South Wales, Tasmania and Victoria and South Australia. And the areas in Western Australia where there's mapped fire records. We didn't use the Landsat option because there's some uncertainties about how well that actually works in forested systems. So these were the best mapped areas. Sorry, and there's the study area. And once we'd populated, sorry, I'll just jump back here. We cut this down into 5 kilometre grid cells, and we came up with 84,000 cells across the study area. And for that, we extracted every one of those data for every one of those nodes and put that together in the model. With these models, what you're able to do is pick one of the nodes there and start to turn the dial and change one part of the model, and it will actually back propagate and forward propagate through the model to change all the other variables to give you an understanding of how that one variable can actually have an influence on the overall system. And so we did this here, and that's what we're calling our dependent effects. And we picked our 4 switches here, so fire, weather, dryness, fuel load, and we picked our 4 switches here, so fire, weather, dryness, fuel load, and ignitions, and we changed them from our 5th percentile value up to our 95% value for each of them. So they're on a similar scale, so we're looking across the range there. And here we have on the y-axis the probability of getting any fire. So across our study area, the extent of these values is all pretty similar. If you increase the dryness of your fuels, you actually decrease the chance of fire, and I'll come back to that in a second. As your fire weather goes up, you increase your chance of fire. More ignitions or more fuel, you increase your chance of fire. And this sort of switch here, or moving up in the fuel loads, the blue line, represents where you're shifting from a grassy system to a litter-dominated system. So this is grassy woodlands or open grasslands moving into forested systems there. The other thing we can do with these models is set values for our other 4 switches and then just change the one switch we're interested in, and that'll give us something about an independent effect. It's just the effect of that one switch without considering changes in anything else. And the thing we can see for this here is, firstly, the responses are much shallower. The patterns are more or less the same. But when you don't consider the changes across all the switches, you don't see such massive changes in what's going on. So if we only cared about fuel loads, we'd only be looking at this one line rather than what might happen across this, the line here on the left. So we realised there's probably different things going on with grasslands and with forests, so we separated those out basically on a 30% modelled tree cover. And I'll focus just on the dependent effects here, but as fire weather goes up in these systems, we're actually seeing a decreased probability of fire, which is quite interesting. And it's probably a case of the fire weathers resulting in drops in fuel continuity or fuel load, or times when fuels are available to burn. So your hot desert areas only occasionally get enough fuel continuity to allow for fires. So it's not a straight relationship, but if we think back to that very first graph from Hamish, so those central areas getting worse fire weather will actually move us down this line here and result in less fire in these areas. We have this little quirk of the data with ignitions that if you've got less ignitions, you're more likely to get a fire. And I think that's a function of reporting. We get lots of ignitions that turn up in the database. They're close to town. People like the CFA go out, put them out before they get to a size that they actually register as a fire. But the small number that are further away from town get to the size of a fire faster. So you only need a couple of ignitions before you start to get fire in these systems. If we then jump to forested areas, we get slightly different patterns. We get this pattern we saw in the overall one here where fuel dryness, as that increases, the chance of a fire actually drops off. And again, it's probably a continuity issue. But then as fuel loads, fire weather, and ignitions all increase, we're seeing an increase in the probability of fire, which matches our expectations. Interestingly, if we looked at the independent effects here in forested system, fuels are having a fairly major effect in overall probability of a fire. And we dig into this, and it's while it looks like a strong line, the ability of fuel management to change it is only moving a small ways along these lines rather than a long way. But that's a story for another day. We then decided we wanted to look specifically at areas taking their existing layout and looking to see what might happen with climate change and what not only the chance of a fire, but what sort of fire or amount of fire we're likely to get. So we started to consider average annual burnt of less than 1%, 1 to 2.5%, 2.5 to 5%, and more than 5% per annum. And so the green and the yellow lines are the ones we'll focus on for the grassy systems, but both of these show a decrease. So this is increasing FDI across the bottom here. Both of these show a decreased probability in occurrence of low or I guess more moderate fires, and the other ones show more or less a flat line. However, if we go into our forested systems, and again we've got the same areas here, as our FDI increases, the green line here for the less than 1%, the probability of having, I guess what you'd say is frequent small fires or less than 1% of the area burnt every year actually increases quite strongly, and the others increase in a relatively weak fashion, I guess you could say, but they are increasing. So we'd expect that in these forested systems, we're going to get more fire, but it's probably going to be smaller fires, more manageable and lower ones. And we're not seeing massive changes in these catastrophic or large fires that burn millions of hectares. So it was an interesting but unexpected result. So I guess in conclusion, this 4-switch model is a really nice way to actually start to look at the fire problem. But we know the importance of each of the 4 switches varies between systems. In grass, weather's probably one of the key drivers, but it's actually the reverse. The worse the fire weather, the less likely you are to have fires. And ignitions are really important there. And so these systems might be ignition limited. However, in the forest, we seem to spend a lot of time there, lots of people there, but it's weather and fuels that are driving the systems here. So when we want to look at the climate change effects, we need to look at how they all fit together. And we need to understand not just how weather changes, but how weather will flow through that system, change ignitions, fuels, and fuel connectivity to actually come up with these answers. And I think what we're heading towards is fire regimes are going to change under future climates and with increased people around. But it's not necessarily the catastrophic changes that were originally predicted. It's probably fires in the realm that land management agencies are actually quite good at dealing with, smaller fires in grassier systems rather than large conflagrations. Thank you.
Trent, I'll open up to the floor and to those people that have joined us on the webinar for some questions. You're happy to take some questions, Trent?
Yep.
That's that first. Michael, been nodding your head all through that talk.
Yes. Fascinating stuff. So, is it on? It's on. Okay. Okay, one thing I would be interested in is your climate change modeling on vegetation structure. And so, because you showed it's very important for the fire regime, do any of these models take into account the rising CO2 in the background as an independent factor? Because I'm mainly thinking there was a recent paper, an observational paper, where they looked at vegetation changes and water yield from catchments across Australia. And I found the results quite fascinating because they were quite unexpected, because our thinking with elevated CO2, which is going in the background, is that vegetation becomes more water use efficient and so saves water and the catchments may become moisture, but actually because vegetation also grows more and the structure changes, it seems that over the past 20 years, the effect was actually the reverse. You had more vegetation that was thirstier and actually dried the catchments out. So that could have a very strong feedback effect for your purposes as well. Is there any consideration given to that?
There's a little bit of work that people are starting to do now. So with the FACE experiment at Hawkesbury, they're trying to look at this, and Stuart Matthews, for the large project we were involved in, Stuart started to look at those. The data coming out, Stuart modelled data as well through one of the CSIRO models, the name escapes me right now. The data that was coming out was showing in the fire sense, the woodiness of the fuels may increase, but that's going to be offset by the broad scale changes in species distribution and occurrence. So those might be able to adapt for a little while, but over time they're less likely to be able to occur there. They also looked at the thickening of leaves and how that might affect the flammability in the fuel beds, and it wasn't sufficient to overcome I can't remember the percentages, but it was only a fraction of the change in fuel load. So even though the woodiness increases it slightly or its flammability slightly, the fact it drops down, it's still that major drop that was driving it. But it's something that people are hopefully looking into.
Thank you. Anybody else? Pull someone out of the crowd at random. Got off the hook, nearly. Alan, thank you.
More of a clarification, Trent, the fire occurrence data that you reported earlier on, was that a combination of both planned and unplanned fire, or only unplanned fires?
In the changes, it was just unplanned fire. Some other work we'd done, we looked at how prescribed fire changed over the time, and it wasn't enough to be resulting in the changes that we saw.
I guess the Dorothy Dix for that one is changes in the amount and distribution of planned fire. Have you guys factored that into these model predictions?
We did start to look at it, but it was basically not an effect that came out. So yeah, these effects are happening independent of management that's going on. So we did put it in the models, but it never came through. So it was never in that next stage.
So if I understand what you just said, that management activities with regards to fuel reduction are trivial compared to
climate?
To climate, yeah.
Compared to the changes we're seeing, yeah. So there's another paper we've done where we've identified where fuel management is having an effect on extent, where past fire is having an effect on future fire, and it's the leverage concept that Owen Price has been working around. There's only a subset of regions where that actually occurs, and it ranges in the Central Highlands, for example. It's about 12 hectares required to reduce by 1 hectare. And around Sydney broadly, it's around 4 to 5 hectares required. Northern New South Wales and the grassy woodlands on the western side of the slopes, it's about 3. So the extent of management is not sufficient to be resulting in massive changes the other way for those areas. Western Australia is a slightly different situation, but the models they've got over there don't actually account for weather. And some of the early work that's been done on putting weather in suggests that weather might be driving things over there as well. But they're not in the room, so we can't talk about that.
Question from Gerd.
Thank you. Trent, can you put up that slide again where you had the Bayesian model or the one before that, the one that you constructed in winter? Yeah.
The winter model?
The winter model.
Yep.
That one there. So you were talking about biomass and productivity and fuel moisture, but not really about fuel type. Is that something that's sort of intrinsic to the others, like dry shrubbery? Wouldn't that burn a lot better than dry grass or shorter sort of grassy type vegetation?
Yeah, and that's the reason we've broken the analysis down into grassier systems or litter-dominated systems. So with the results, when we went to put less animations, we took a 30% level there. So those that have model tree cover above 30% are forests which are litter and shrub systems of varying degrees. And I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here. When we come back here, the productivity sort of plays out in there within each of those regions. So looking at across the whole study region, yeah, is sort of curious, but it's missing a lot of information. So that's why we look at the smaller areas, and we are going then down to each of the bioregions to have a closer look at some of these things to see if any of those things are really shifting patterns on that level.
Anybody else? Julian?
Trent, a question about ignitions. So ignitions, you talked about this a little earlier in the talk. Ignitions are lightning strikes, but also arson. What's some? I can't quite remember whether you covered this or not. But what's the relative influence of arson, and has anybody shown what might happen if we could, for example, substantially reduce the number of human ignitions?
So the easy part first, in a modelling sense, yes, if you reduce ignitions, you have a major effect on total fires. That's the easy part. The hard part is, so about 10% of our ignitions are lightning, 90% of them human caused. Damage is slightly different. Power lines and lightning often do a bit more damage because they start further away and can burn in. In terms of whether we can do anything about the human ignitions, it's not easy. There's basically, the people that are working in the area have come up with the answer of no. We have so many ignitions in the landscape anyway that we're probably at saturation, but total fire bans and making people more aware, having fire crews responding quickly to ignitions is one way in which they're dealt with. So there is an increased awareness when total fire bans are advertised, and I think there's in Western Australia, Matt Plasinski was showing there's a marginal drop in ignitions over there when a total fire ban is called. Although the Rolling Stone fire, they had someone who should have known better, had actually was using an angle grinder because they didn't realise that was part of included in total fire ban. arson itself is an extremely complex issue, and I think there's 9 different types of arsonists, everything from kids playing around in the forest to serial killers. And it's frightening. Some of the serial killers are also arson investigators as well. So they do a very good job. But there's a lot of evidence it's actually coming back to childhood abuse as well, and it's attention-getting behaviours that have links to strong social problems. So it's not a fire problem per se, it's a part of a broader social issue, and it's the more I read about it, the more complex it is, and the less likely I think we're actually going to be able to do anything from a fire management perspective. But
yeah, thanks. So I guess I actually reckon that it might be an area where we can do a lot. It seems to me that that's because so many ignitions are by people. There is potential there to actually reduce that sorts of ignitions, but it is going to be a hard job and take some imaginative work, I guess, in the future.
we could shut down railways, roads and power lines, and we'd have no problem stopping 80% of the ignitions. That help?
Also, maybe need a license to have matches.
Yeah, so you're right, it does have a lot of potential to change things. It's the strategies to do it don't work very well at this point.
One out, Trent?
Just getting started.
Oh, okay, sure. Still got some time, but I thought I'd cut it short if you wanted, and we could go and have some morning tea. I think if I correctly analyse your work, we only have to worry a little bit more than we are worrying now.
Get our house in order now, we should be right in
Get our house in order. It's only a slightly more worrisome future. Thank you very much, Trent, for today. We've got a speaker next week, Nina Hinko-Ulmana, who will be doing a completion seminar. So join us for that if you like, if you're around. But other than that, if you could thank Trent one more time for his stunning performance today.